You're standing in the middle of what was once the most terrifying yet magnificent structure in the ancient world. The roar of 50,000 bloodthirsty spectators echoes through stone corridors that have witnessed more death and glory than any other building in human history. This is the Roman Colosseum, and beneath your feet lies a labyrinth of secrets that shaped an empire and defined what it meant to be human in the face of certain death. Most people think they know the story of Roman gladiators. They imagine muscle-bound warriors fighting to the death for the entertainment of a cruel emperor. But the reality was far more complex, far more brutal, and infinitely more fascinating than any Hollywood movie could capture. The gladiatorial arenas weren't just places of entertainment. They were instruments of political control, religious expression, and social engineering on a scale that would make modern propaganda ministers jealous. The story begins not with the famous Colosseum, but centuries earlier, when Rome was still clawing its way to dominance over the Italian peninsula. The first gladiatorial combats weren't public spectacles at all. They were private funeral rites, bloody ceremonies designed to honor the dead by spilling the blood of the living. Wealthy Roman families would force prisoners of war to fight to the death at family funerals, believing that the violence would appease the spirits of their deceased relatives and ensure safe passage to the afterlife. But what started as a religious ritual quickly became something far more sinister and powerful. Roman politicians discovered that nothing captured public attention quite like the sight of men fighting for their lives. The funeral games grew larger, more elaborate, and more frequent. Soon, ambitious Romans were hosting gladiatorial contests, not just for the dead, but for the living voters who could secure their political careers. By the time Augustus became the first Roman emperor, the games had evolved into the ultimate tool of imperial control. The emperor who could provide the most spectacular, the most deadly, and the most exotic entertainment would win the hearts and minds of the Roman people. It was a simple equation that would define Roman politics for the next 4 centuries. Keep the people fed and entertained, and they'll never question your absolute power over their lives. The construction of the Colosseum itself tells this story perfectly. When the Emperor Vespasian began building the massive amphitheater in 70 AD, he chose the most symbolic location possible. The arena rose from the ruins of Nero's Golden House, the despised palace where the previous emperor had lived in obscene luxury while Rome burned around him. Vespasian's message was clear. Where once a tyrant built monuments to his own ego, now the people would have their temple of blood and sand. The engineering marvel that emerged from 8 years of construction was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The Colosseum could hold more spectators than most modern football stadiums, and its sophisticated design ensured that every single person had a perfect view of the carnage below. But the real innovation lay beneath the arena floor, in a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical devices that would have impressed even modern engineers. This underground realm, known as the hypogeum, was where the magic happened. Teams of skilled workers operated an intricate system of pulleys, counterweights, and elevators that could lift wild animals, elaborate stage sets, and condemn prisoners up through trapdoors in the arena floor. Imagine the terror of a criminal who suddenly found himself face to face with a hungry lion that had appeared as if by magic from the very ground beneath his feet. The hypogem wasn't just about special effects. It was a carefully organized machine of death that processed human lives with industrial efficiency. Different areas housed different types of participants in the deadly games. Professional gladiators had their own quarters, equipped with training facilities and medical stations. Wild animals were kept in reinforced cages, their roars echoing through the stone corridors day and night. Condemned criminals awaited their gruesome fates in holding cells, knowing that their only escape was through the arena floor above. The logistics of keeping this death machine running were staggering. Every day of games required hundreds of animals, dozens of human participants, and countless support staff. Ships arrived at Roman ports carrying lions from Africa, bears from the northern forests, and exotic creatures from the farthest reaches of the empire. Professional animal trainers worked alongside skilled hunters to ensure that every beast performed its deadly role exactly as scripted. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the gladiatorial system was how it transformed ordinary people into both killers and heroes. Most gladiators weren't the noble warriors of popular imagination. They were slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose except their lives. Yet within the brutal confines of the gladiatorial schools, these broken men could achieve something remarkable. They could become gods. The training regimen that created gladiators was as sophisticated as any modern athletic program. New recruits were sorted based on their physical attributes and fighting potential. Some became heavily armored fighters who relied on strength and endurance. Others developed into quick, lightly armored warriors who won through speed and agility. Each type of gladiator had specialized weapons, armor, and fighting techniques that took years to master. The gladiatorial schools themselves were prisons, but they were also elite training facilities where the best instructors money could buy taught the deadliest arts known to man. Former gladiators who had won their freedom often returned as trainers, passing on the skills that had kept them alive through dozens of life-or-death battles. The most successful schools produced fighters whose names were known throughout the empire, warriors who could fill an amphitheater just by appearing on the program. What made the whole system even more complex was the fact that not all gladiators were there against their will. Free Roman citizens sometimes chose to enter the arena, trading their liberty for the chance at glory and riches. These voluntary gladiators had to take a sacred oath that bound them body and soul to their new profession. They swore to endure burning, beating, and death by the sword, willingly surrendering their rights as citizens to become property of their trainers. The psychology behind this choice reveals something profound about Roman society and human nature itself. In a world where most people lived in poverty and obscurity, the arena offered the possibility of achieving immortality through violence. A gladiator who fought with skill and courage could win not just his freedom, but eternal fame. His name would be remembered long after emperors were forgotten, carved in stone, and celebrated in poetry. Yet for every gladiator who achieved legendary status, dozens died in anonymity, their blood soaking into the sand while the crowd cheered for fresh entertainment. The mortality rate in the arenas was horrific, but it varied greatly depending on the type of combat and the skill level of the participants. Professional gladiator matches, where both fighters were valuable investments, often ended with both combatants surviving. But when condemned criminals were forced to fight untrained and poorly equipped, the slaughter could be absolute. The crowd that watched these deadly spectacles was just as complex as the fighters themselves. Roman society was rigidly stratified, and the seating arrangements in the Colosseum reflected every nuance of social hierarchy. The emperor sat in his private box, surrounded by his family and closest advisors. Senators occupied the front rows, their white togas marking them as Rome's elite. Behind them sat the wealthy merchants and landowners, followed by ordinary citizens, and finally, at the very top of the amphitheater, the slaves and foreigners who were barely considered human at all. But when the games began, these social distinctions could temporarily dissolve in the shared excitement of watching men die for sport. The emperor himself became both god and judge in these moments, his thumb determining who lived and who died, with a casual gesture that held more power than entire armies. When a gladiator fell and raised his finger in submission, the crowd would erupt in a frenzy of opinion, their voices rising and falling like ocean waves as they debated the fighter's fate. The emperor, reading the mood of his people, would either grant mercy or condemn the defeated warrior to death, always balancing political calculation with the bloodlust of the masses. This dynamic created one of history's most twisted forms of democracy, where the survival of human beings was decided by popular vote. A gladiator who had fought bravely might live to see another day, while one who showed cowardice could be executed even in victory. The crowd's judgment was harsh, but not entirely without logic. They respected skill, courage, and entertainment value above all else. A fighter who gave them a spectacular show, even in defeat, stood a better chance of walking away alive than one who won through boring tactics. The religious dimension of the games added another layer of complexity that modern audiences often miss. These weren't just secular entertainments, but sacred rituals that connected Rome to its gods and ancestors. Each day of games began with elaborate ceremonies, sacrifices, and prayers that sanctified the violence to come. The spilling of blood in the arena was seen as an offering to the gods, a way of maintaining the divine favor that kept Rome strong and prosperous. Different types of combat carried different religious significance. When criminals were executed by wild beasts at midday, it was viewed as divine justice, the gods themselves devouring those who had offended the natural order. When gladiators fought with honor and skill, it demonstrated Roman virtues of courage and discipline that pleased both gods and ancestors. Even the exotic animals brought from distant lands served a religious purpose, showing Rome's dominion over the natural world that the gods had entrusted to their care. The economic engine that powered the gladiatorial system was massive and incredibly sophisticated. Entire industries existed solely to feed the arena's insatiable appetite for spectacle. Professional animal hunters scoured the known world for the most dangerous and exotic creatures they could find. Ship captains specialized in transporting wild beasts across the Mediterranean, their vessels equipped with specialized cages and feeding systems. Local economies throughout the empire depended on supplying Rome with the materials needed for its deadly entertainments. The cost of a single day's games could bankrupt a wealthy family or drain a provincial treasury. Exotic animals commanded enormous prices, with a single lion costing more than most Romans would earn in a lifetime. The elaborate costumes, weapons, and stage sets required for the more theatrical presentations demanded the skills of the empire's finest craftsmen. Even the sand that covered the arena floor was specially treated to absorb blood more effectively, a detail that reveals the industrial scale of the killing that took place. But the true genius of the system lay in how it transformed death into profit. Successful gladiators became valuable commodities whose market value could fluctuate wildly based on their performance and popularity. The best fighters commanded appearance fees that would make modern athletes jealous, while their trainers and owners built fortunes on their success. Betting on gladiatorial contests became a massive industry, with odds carefully calculated by professional gamblers who studied each fighter's strengths and weaknesses like modern sports analysts. The medical care provided to gladiators was surprisingly advanced, driven by the simple economic reality that trained fighters were expensive to replace. Gladiatorial schools employed some of the empire's most skilled physicians, men who developed surgical techniques and treatments that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. These doctors understood anatomy in ways that civilian physicians never could, having dissected countless human bodies and treated every conceivable type of combat injury. The most famous of these arena physicians was a Greek doctor named Galen, whose work treating gladiators in the provinces eventually earned him a position as personal physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. His detailed observations of human anatomy, based on years of treating gladiatorial wounds, formed the foundation of medical knowledge for the next 15 centuries. In a twisted way, the brutality of the arena advanced human understanding of the body far beyond what peacetime medicine could have achieved. The daily routine of a gladiator was a strange mixture of luxury and terror that few people could psychologically survive for long. Most gladiatorial schools provided their fighters with excellent food, comfortable quarters, and access to the best training equipment money could buy. Successful gladiators lived better than most free Romans, enjoying privileges and luxuries that would have seemed impossible given their legal status as slaves or condemned criminals. They were celebrities in their own right, with fans who followed their careers obsessively and women who threw themselves at famous fighters despite the social taboos involved. Yet beneath this surface glamour lay the constant awareness that every training session might be their last, that every meal could be a condemned man's final feast. The psychological pressure of living under a death sentence while maintaining peak physical condition broke many fighters before they ever set foot in the arena. Some gladiators committed suicide rather than face the terror of combat, while others suffered complete mental breakdowns that left them useless for fighting The training itself was designed to break down normal human inhibitions against killing while building up the specific skills needed for arena combat. New gladiators practiced on wooden posts for months before they were allowed to spar with other fighters. They learned not just how to use their weapons effectively, but how to die with dignity if defeat became inevitable. The most important lesson wasn't about fighting technique, but about performance, understanding that their role was to entertain the crowd even as they struggled for their lives. Different gladiatorial schools developed distinct fighting styles and specialties that became their trademarks. Some focused on producing heavily armored fighters who could absorb tremendous punishment while delivering devastating counterattacks. Others specialized in quick, agile warriors who relied on speed and precision to overcome larger opponents. The most elite schools produced fighters who could adapt to any situation, masters of multiple weapon systems who could provide spectacular entertainment regardless of who they faced. The weapons and armor used by gladiators were works of art in themselves, crafted by the finest smiths and artisans in the empire. Each piece was custom-fitted to the individual fighter, designed not just for protection, but for maximum visual impact. The distinctive helmets worn by different types of gladiators became iconic symbols that spectators could recognize instantly across the vast arena floor. A retiarius carried his weighted net and trident with the same pride that a modern athlete might display an Olympic medal, knowing that these tools were the only things standing between him and a gruesome death. The psychological warfare that took place before gladiators ever crossed swords was just as important as their physical skills. Fighters developed elaborate entrance routines designed to intimidate their opponents and excite the crowd. Some would perform complex weapon displays that showcased their speed and precision, while others relied on pure intimidation, flexing their muscles in roaring challenges that echoed through the stone corridors. The crowd's reaction to these pre-fight rituals could shift the psychological balance before the first blow was struck. What made gladiatorial combat truly unique was how it blended genuine, mortal danger with theatrical performance. Unlike modern sports, where athletes compete within carefully controlled safety parameters, gladiators had to maintain their entertainment value while literally fighting for their lives. A boring fight, even one that ended in death, disappointed the audience and reflected poorly on the gladiators' training and character. The most successful fighters learned to choreograph their battles, creating moments of high drama that kept spectators on the edge of their seats. The referee system that governed these life-and-death contests was surprisingly sophisticated. Trained officials monitored every aspect of the combat, ensuring that fights proceeded according to established rules and traditions. These referees could intervene to separate fighters, call for medical attention, or even halt a contest if they detected cowardice or rule violations. Their decisions carried enormous weight, since a referee's assessment of a gladiator's performance could influence the crowd's judgment when the time came to decide between life and death. The seasonal rhythms of gladiatorial combat follow the religious and political calendar of Rome itself. Major festivals demanded spectacular games that could last for weeks, featuring hundreds of fighters and thousands of exotic animals. These marathon events required months of preparation and planning, with advanced teams scouring the empire for suitable participants and organizing the complex logistics needed to transport and house such vast numbers of combatants and creatures. The summer months brought the most elaborate spectacles, when favorable weather allowed for the full range of arena entertainments. Naval battles could be staged in flooded amphitheaters, complete with full-sized warships, and hundreds of participants recreating famous historical conflicts. These aquatic massacres required engineering expertise that rivaled anything achieved by Roman military architects, transforming arenas into temporary lakes where condemned prisoners fought and died in choreographed naval engagements. Winter Games took on a different character, focusing more on individual combat and exotic animal displays that could be staged regardless of weather conditions. These colder months also provided opportunities for more experimental entertainments, as organizers tested new concepts and combinations that might be expanded for the grander summer festivals. Some of the most innovative and memorable gladiatorial presentations emerged from these off-season experiments. The international dimension of the gladiatorial system created a complex network of cultural exchange that spread Roman values throughout the conquered territories. Local populations in distant provinces built their own amphitheaters and developed regional variations on Roman gladiatorial traditions. These provincial games served as tools of cultural assimilation, teaching conquered peoples to embrace Roman concepts of honor, courage, and acceptable violence. The secrets buried beneath the Roman gladiator arenas reveal a civilization that understood the dark art of human manipulation on a scale that remains unmatched in human history. These weren't just buildings where people died for entertainment. They were sophisticated machines of political control that transformed death into spectacle, brutality into art, and human suffering into the very foundation of imperial power. The next time you hear someone dismiss the Romans as simply bloodthirsty savages, remember that they created a system so psychologically effective that it kept an empire of 50 million people united under one rule for centuries. The gladiators may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every stadium, every arena, and every place where crowds gather to watch others compete for glory.